Hello, and on behalf of Femtech World, welcome to this Femtech Roundtable. Today we're focusing on the next generation of Femtech, equity, access and impact. I think we all know that despite incredible advances in medicine generally, there's been a persistent and well-documented gender health gap, and that continues to impact on millions of women worldwide. So today, we're going to focus in on the future of Femtech, which we know is a booming sector, and really explore what that future looks like and the potential to close that gap. So we're really focusing on solutions and innovation today. We've got a fabulous group of panelists with us today who've agreed to share their insight and their experience, and it really is a diverse group, so we'll cover lots of ground today. I'm going to ask all of our panelists just to say a few words about themselves by way of introduction, their organisation or their areas of specific interest. And as I see everybody in the screen, Aimee, I'm going to pick on you firstly, I hope you don't mind, and ask you to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello, Aimee Corso. So I lead commercial and growth at Mirvie. We are a women's health diagnostic company, specifically working in the area of pregnancy complications today. So we're looking to be able to predict those complications before they happen so that we can truly turn around the poor outcomes that we see globally for women who are having babies.
Great, thanks very much, Aimee. Anastasiya, if I can come to you next, please.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. A pleasure to be here. My name is Anastasiya Markvarde, and I work as an independent women's health expert. I have a career in health innovation, working for an advisory in health innovation, developing innovative strategies and product for pharma companies, and then also helping to scale health startups. And in the last few years, I started to focus on women's health, realizing all the gaps there are in the industry. So my activities lie in several areas. I advise startups, I advise companies on women's health. I also publish regular publications on the topic. And I also represent Finland, which is where I'm based, in the organization called Femtech Across Borders, where we have 73 countries representing their Femtech ecosystems, trying to work together to advance in this area. Glad to join this conversation today.
Fabulous, thanks Anastasiya. Sandip.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandip. I'm Head of Healthcare at Answer Digital. We're a digital transformation consultancy in England, UK, specialists in England and UK healthcare. We've been working with Genomics England and NHS England for the last 5 to 10 years. So exciting and work going on there with personalised care. And I've got a keen interest in women's health and helping women's health organisations access to clinical standards and interoperability in England and the 4 nations.
Thanks very much, Sandip. If I can come to you next, Wolfgang.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the opportunity of being part of this panel. I'm Wolfgang Hackl. I'm a founder and the leader of OncoGenomX. By training, I am an oncologist, but through my career, I've covered the different aspects of cancer in general, from basic research over patient treatment, over drug development, and now diagnostics development with a special view on artificial intelligence and machine learning as a tool or tools to improve diagnostic methods. We are a group of 8 partners spread all over the world, covering all the different aspects that you require if you want to build a company like ours. And most importantly, 2 of our partners, including myself, we have already launched one such platform very successfully. So we've bring quite some experience to this table.
Great, thank you, Wolfgang. And Denise, if I can come to you next, please.
Sure. So I'm Denise Pines. I'm based in California, specifically Los Angeles. I am in medical regulation. So I'm the president of the Osteopathic Medical Board of California. I've been past president of the Medical Board of California, and then I served on the Federation of All State Medical Boards in the U.S. and the U.S. territories. I'm the co-founder also of the Fem Aging Project, and there we focus on innovations that are designed for women 40 plus by producing health tech reports, webinars, and pitch competitions to try to drive more solutions for women 40 plus. So that's my focus. And that came into focus when I got a hot flash.
Thanks very much, Denise. And Annie.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Annie Thériault, managing partner of Cross Border Impact Ventures. We're a health technology impact fund. The firm is based in Toronto, and we manage funds here in Canada and Luxembourg. Our investment strategy is quite global. So we invest in companies based in North America and Europe that have products that benefit women and children globally. And we truly mean that. That is part of our impact strategy. And so the portfolio of companies we invest in look like, very typical venture-backable companies. They are aiming to grow and scale in the North American and European markets. But beyond that, they make an impact pledge with our firm to bring their solutions into the African and Indian market. Typically, we do measure and count impact, essentially the additionality of the firms through all low and middle income countries, but we have a special intentionality towards India and Africa, where we have more network. What else could I say? We're excited to be here and discuss a little more about our strategy. We focus on the whole of women's health, I suppose, and the whole of children's health. So that means health areas that are specifically for women or children, areas that are different between men and women or children, and areas that are disproportionately impacting women and or children. So I'll leave it there. Happy to be here. Alistair, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Annie. I'm going to go around the panel again and kick off the discussion by asking each of our panelists to say a little bit about the issues, the challenges, but also the opportunities as they see them for advancement and development in the areas of Femtech. And then we'll come on to talk about innovation and how we translate those opportunities into results, new approaches. So again, I'm afraid starting with you, Aimee, as it'll give everybody else a chance to have a little think about what they wish to say. Issues, challenges, and opportunities.
Absolutely. Well, I think, Alistair, as you kicked off the conversation for this great group of panelists, you mentioned, really the disparity that has happened, right? And that largely has stemmed from the fact that women have been underrepresented in, the science of medicine, from very early on. And so, we find ourselves at this point in time where we just have not had a data-driven approach to women's health. And that gap has only widened as women were excluded from trials, or, we treated the data that, women were just small men, right? So we've learned across the, continuum of someone's life that just doesn't pan out. Specifically in the area that I focus on, pregnancy, the data speaks for itself, which is unfortunately that the maternal death rate has only increased. Here in the US, it's doubled since 2018. And this is a systemic problem. For me, I think obviously research across women's health and the unique biology of women is incredibly important. The biology is different. We know that. And with advances in personalized medicine that has happened in other areas such as cancer or cardiovascular disease, I think bringing personalized medicine to women's health and specifically pregnancy is very important. Pregnancy is such a global issue. Industrialized nations have rates that are similar to non-industrialized nations. That just is no longer acceptable. And I think what's very exciting about using data-driven approaches is we know that it's very difficult to provide resources to everyone. So how do we truly, find people who need that help, find women who need help early in their pregnancy or as they reach menopause years, so that resources can be efficiently used, right? It isn't about one size fits all. And in the case of pregnancy, it's been a one size fits all process. In the US, the way care is delivered, the number of visits hasn't changed for more than 100 years, which is pretty staggering. I think it's really time for next generation care. And I think that, we're seeing a lot of investments in Femtech, which is great, but we have to accelerate that so that we, can't just begin to talk about the conversation. We actually do drive transformation.
That's a great way to start the discussion. Thanks, Aimee. Anastasiya, the same question really as you see it, issues, challenges, but also opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. Totally agree with Aimee on that. And maybe what I could highlight is the lack of awareness around women's health. So basically, maybe it's better seen through my personal story. I worked a lot with top managers of big pharma companies. And when I started to focus more on women's health and I started talking to everyone about it, both on social media and personally and at the conferences, and I realized that even people at the pharma companies, which are supposed to know more about our biology and about how the drugs are developed, actually know very little about these systemic issues, unless maybe they're specifically faced, their role is specifically facing interaction with women. So before we even get to the point where we can act, hopefully we're getting there now, we have so much work to do in terms of awareness. So first, we're totally lacking education on women's health, and I'm talking both about education at the university level, so educating, for example, researchers that are working on some future spin-out project that they need to pay attention towards women's health, and in general, innovation and technology students, for example, about the opportunities in the area, but also, of course, healthcare professional education, but then as well even corporate education and education of employers, how they need to approach women's health, for example, even when we're speaking about menopause and the drastic effect of menopause on work productivity. It's also largely employers' responsibility to provide great care for their employees. Then after that, of course, we need to work on awareness of policymakers, because again, now we're seeing some great news in this area. For example, Australia dedicated 573 million to subsidize women's health in many different aspects, but overall there is a lack of systemic approach to this. There is a huge lack of clinical guidelines on many conditions, including even such areas as childbirth that are critical to our society and to everyone, but also, for example, for menopause. Here in the Nordics, there are some clinical guidelines in a few countries, such as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Finland currently doesn't have guidelines, for example, but they're in development. And again, even if we have some guidelines, they're not necessarily used all the time because they're not obligatory. And of course, there are many other layers to this awareness. So my point here is that before we can create a plan on how to act on this, we first need to educate so many people on so many levels about the issue. And well, I could talk more about it, but I guess I give space to others and we can continue with action points later.
Thanks, Anastasiya, but I'm sure we'll come back to that theme of education and awareness and access. Sandip, same question, issues, but also opportunities.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would probably say from my point of view, going off what Denise said, it really came to light when I got diagnosed with PCOS, of the lack of awareness and information that there is out there, the lack of research there is out there. So, you know, I'm going to finding out myself on Google, as you do, and it really opened my eyes to some of, you know, the issues around women's health and got me really interested in that. So I think there's many issues. There's been a lack of research over the years. I think we've spoken about that. But in terms of challenges that I think that are out there, are the lack of funding towards women's health, the lack of policy, Those are the two things that, when I look at funding in England, for example, there's a lot of funding going to other important, priority use cases like cancer, diabetes, and all of that. They all get funded pretty well. And we're setting up secure data environments for research across the country. But I've not heard anybody talk about, let's set one up specifically for women's health. Let's do research on the data that we've already got available instead of trying to create more data. We've got GP data, we've got research data all across the country. Why don't we use that to first of all figure out what the data gaps are, and then we can, after that, try and get more data in for women's health, create more standards, create data sets specifically for that. Opportunities wise, I think personalized care with genomics is definitely something that is innovative in the way forward, because that's specifically would be for the woman based off of her DNA, and it won't be the same issues that we've had before. And obviously AI, heard last week that AI is now able to scan research documents and find out what the bias is, for male and female bias on those research papers. And so just more and more information like that is just going to be the way forward for us, and really excited about some of the innovations that are, we're looking into at the moment for women's health, and I'm so excited about being involved in that as well.
Thanks, Andy. And we'll definitely come back to talk about innovation. I do apologise to Wolfgang, Denise and Annie, because I know as we go around the panel, it's harder and harder to focus. Haven't already been spoken about, but I'm sure you'll give us your perspective. Wolfgang. You're on mute, Wolfgang.
Yeah, I concur with everything that has been said to that point, but let me bring also some cancer-specific considerations into the mix. Not really surprisingly, but cancer care, as it has been designed, was also designed as a gender-neutral discipline. This is not specific for cancer; it applies to many other healthcare sectors and indications. But as a consequence, as everybody understands, lots of differences, of important differences, are overlooked. Very obvious biological and physical and physiologic differences. How does that impact? One very prominent example is women are more likely to experience serious side effects, but on the other hand, they are less likely to receive tailored care. A lot of this really has to do with biology and physiology, and we are just at the beginning of understanding this. There's other aspects, the gender bias in clinical studies. All of us know about this, but in cancer research, to the best of my knowledge, at best 30% of the trial populations are women. This has to change given the fact that 50% of the world's population is females, right? We can't really afford ignoring this aspect. This misrepresentation in clinical studies obviously has also consequences for everything that follows, starting with cancer diagnosis, over treatment, and outcomes. One important aspect that strikes me when I was exposed to it is really women have a completely different perception of cancer. It has to do with their role. It has to do with their societal and cultural position. And of course, it involves also psychological aspects, not really surprisingly. But last not least, I'd also like to mention the fact that social determinants have an enormous impact on how women with cancer get treated, how they get diagnosed in first place, what the outcome is. We all know about the big difference between high income and low income countries, but even within high income countries, there's big differences. So talking about opportunities, in my opinion, the biggest opportunity is really bringing in the perspective of 50% of the world's population, females. They got to be subjects of clinical trials. They need to be involved in the design of trials. They need to be involved in the development of products, in the application of products, in the therapeutic decision making. I think with these aspects, we can already make a big change. Last but not least, the cancer field is probably one of the medical fields where big strides have been made over the past 15, 20 years. The vast majority of it applies to male cancers, but the knowledge that we have collected is a knowledge trove, rich of information. We just have to sort the details and understand how many of the learnings can apply to women in a very tailored way, and close the gaps by information, by data that have been generated or will be generated with women as the subjects of the investigation, if you wish.
Thanks, Wolfgang. And Denise, challenges and opportunities.
So for me, I think it's impossible to talk about innovation in women's health without addressing really who's left behind. And so being a woman of color, I'm always looking at women of color often are the face the compounding barriers. And it's not just due to gender, you know, when we talk about women, but it's gender, it's the intersection, gender, race, income, access. And women of color face delayed diagnosis, higher rates of chronic conditions, lower access to culturally competent care during midlife, because that's where I focus, but even beyond that, right? Aimee talked about the birth data, mortality data. One of the things I didn't share that I also do is I'm a filmmaker. I have produced 13 documentaries. One documentary has been on called Birthing Justice, about the Black maternal health crisis in the US. And most recently, the M Factor, shedding the silence on menopause. So I think the opportunities, you know, that Femtech has to address is designing with intersectionality in mind. Like the one fits all solutions just fail women of color. And I think this is where Femtech can really and actively close the gaps and reinforce, what is really needed. Because if we have the right data, not biased data, and we have the algorithms where we talk about how someone just mentioned about how AI can diagnose faster and then match with the funding, I think we could solve a lot of problems. But tech is tech, and humans have to interact with tech, right? I just came back from literally almost at midnight last night from Washington State with my father, who's in assisted living care. And yes, there's a lot of tech that goes into helping him because he just had a pacemaker put in. He has to have his diabetes monitored, but there's still the care of that individual that walks in that room. And I think a lot of times with tech, we forget how to connect the tech to the people, right? How to deliver on what the tech can do. So if the tech can improve outcomes by algorithms, by being able to make a diagnosis fast, then how does that diagnosis of care actually come through, right? Cultural competency is really important in the platforms that we created. There's several solutions. There's something called Health in Her Hue, which looks at connecting Black women with culturally competent healthcare providers. A lot of women of color show up and the provider doesn't understand the culture of which they come from. And that can just be how they socialize, how they eat, to how they even present themselves to the doctor, meaning they want to look like they're great and that they've done something fabulous when they show up to the doctor, but in fact, they haven't been really living that way. And the doctor then is not able to accurately diagnose. There's another app called Earth app, which is like a Yelp for prenatal and postpartum care. And it's focused on Black and brown women here in the US who have had experiences in the healthcare system. And so basically what it does is it lets you know whether this hospital or this particular practitioner it has done well, and being very specific and giving you advice when you go in, if that's your doctor, how to deal with that particular doctor. And then we talked about funding. Funders of color are often overlooked, yet they really produce the most culturally relevant solutions, right? So here are these huge audiences of people of color. Femtech people who are of color create actually solutions that are more culturally relevant, and yet they cannot get funding for those things. So that lens that I come through in this particular part of the conversation is that we have to start designing with women of color of mind, and not just for them. Because if we design it with them in mind, then we are inclusive, right?
That's great, Denise. Thanks for that. And actually, if you've got some links to your films, I'm sure the team at Femtech would love to get them posted up on the site as well. I suspect somebody will get in touch to talk about that. And Annie, last but not least, your thoughts on challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Such an interesting conversation. Learning a lot for sure. I'll address the funding gaps because that's really where the focus of my work is, on the finance side of things. And I think it's well known and well appreciated, documented that there's a massive funding gap towards women's health. And what I always find interesting, because I'm part of a lot of different networks, is that these funding gaps are throughout the whole span, from early science done in the university setting, well before any of us here that are looking at products and commercialization can be involved. But there's a need for more capital to be invested in that very early stage, where even if we think of the fact that the majority of drugs are developed on male cells, so can we diversify that pool a little bit and ensure that scientists that are doing research over the whole area of healthcare have access to the funding that they need to study both genders? Because what we do know is that typically the male models, whether it's the male cell animal model or human model is used, the male is easier to study often than the female model. And so I do think that it's a need to add some financial capital behind adding a gender element to the majority of research to make sure that we have that data from that early discovery point, so that ultimately the products that are commercialized are better. Then if we move a little further, it's that translation of research into technology. Again, this is still in the land of grant funding. Typically, I'm Canadian, this would be funded by our government organizations, funneled through the universities or accelerators for that early technology development. Similarly, we see similar programs. A good funder that we know that does some of this sort of early productization is a group called LifeArc in the UK. In the US, we'll see where things evolve, but this was in the land of ARPA-H, NIH, that are being challenged today to do the exact thing that I said, to add a gender element to the product translation. But in Europe, we see the EIC having an important role to play there for that sort of early stage productization. And then when we move from research to early product, it's sort of the seed stage VC. And in the past years, what we saw is a good number of early stage VC funds, but still we see, the number of times I meet fellow fund managers that are raising seed funds, and it takes them 2-3 years to close a very small fund, like 10 to 25 million to focus on women's health. And the moment they say things like medtech, it becomes more challenging, and for a very good reason, by the way. Medtech investing at the seed stage is a 10 to 15 year game. It's not a 4 to 6 year game. And so there needs to be a little bit of innovation or a little bit of a change in thinking when we think of particularly the med tech sector. I think it can be a little faster in femtech, health tech areas, but certainly anything that has to do with a medical device, a diagnostic tool, or a treatment, it's a bit of a longer game. So we need different models to fund those seed funds. And then where I play, which is sort of the early growth VC, so we tend to invest around the time of commercialization when there is CE mark or FDA on at least one technology, or alternatively, if it's not a regulated platform, we look for 1 to 10 million of revenue. Again, I don't have that many colleagues focused on women's health, and there's some funds that will touch upon it as part of their strategy, but they tend to focus either on a sort of purely digital platforms. We're a deeper tech fund. We will look at technologies that have more of that regulatory need or clinical validation need, more complex technologies. We don't work with many different groups. There's 4 or 5 of us funds that focus exclusively on women's health, and children's health there's 2 or 3 of us. So we need more colleagues. It needs to be a little bit easier to raise these kinds of funds. And certainly what I will say is our companies proportionately struggle a little more when they have discussions with kind of typical VC funds. If they're strictly focused on a woman or a child application, it's a little harder. And some of the reasons for the turndowns can be because of lack of knowledge and expertise in quote unquote the typical VC industry, because they tend to be a little more focused on either healthcare areas that focus on men or areas that focus on the whole population. There's also been a trend lately, both in the kind of early to late stage VC and I would say also in the corporate side, to focus on more expensive applications that are sold, almost with a Cartier business model, which I will say, where the products are, thousands of dollars to buy, whether it's a drug or a diagnostic service, up to, $1 million. And so when a VC firm looks at a deal in kind of the typical work, they will look for these expensive solutions for these rarer diseases, whereas women's health areas are often like super common. So if we think of menstrual hygiene or any kind of menstrual disorder, pregnancy, menopause, this affects practically the whole of the female population. And so you need to think a little differently about business model, both from the acquirer's side. So you need to look at different acquirers that could be tempted to look at the women's health areas, but also from a VC point of view, it's a different way of thinking. So it's in some sense a bit normal that the investor pool is not as rich as it might be, because the businesses need to look differently. You can't really sell an endometriosis management product, whether it's diagnostic or treatment, for $1 million when 10% of the female population suffers from the condition. It has to be a different approach. So we do need, in addition to more capital, we do need a change of thinking. And I guess in closing my comments, what I will say is, as an investor, we view this as our opportunity. The way that plays out in our portfolio, it's really around looking at on the strictly sort of exclusively women or child. It's really trying to think a little more broadly about commercialization and financing, we look to companies that can finance with grants in addition to capital so that we ensure that we have good returns. And then on our portfolio that's a little more diverse, so looking at applications, for example, in the cardiovascular health space, how we manage our investments is that we'll look to see, what is the extra investment needed to expand the market opportunity of those companies so that they not only treat areas of cardiovascular health that are more common in men, but also add those that are more common in women. And in addition to that, we pay a lot of attention to clinical trial design to ensure that anything that has some sort of a photonic component to it looks at a racially diverse population set to ensure that those products work on all people. And it's surprisingly easy with a little bit of mathematical tweaks what you can do. You just need to know and think about the changes you need to do. And then you end up with a better solution. So we don't see a misalignment between broader impact and the management of that. So I'll just pause there. Thank you, Alistair.
Thanks for that insight, Annie. I'm not going to go around the panel again, but just open up the discussion now. We've talked quite a lot about challenges and touched on opportunities. I'm really keen to hear about new approaches and innovation that promise positive change for the future. So rather than doing the little electronic hand thing, just give me a little wave or something, and I'll just bring people in to talk about new approaches and innovation and developments that you'd like to discuss. Aimee, I'll come to you first, then Anastasiya, then Wolfgang. Aimee.
Yeah, thank you. I think jumping off what Annie was saying and really the rest of the group as well, something that I think is interesting about women's health, and we have to, I think, seize the day, if you will, is when we talk about research and bringing innovation, as Annie discussed, from, the bench really, to what we say the bedside, or really to the people who need it. To me, what's unique about women's health as a category is when you think about the conditions, pregnancy, moving to menopause, these are well-defined timelines. And that's what's often difficult in research. Cancer, defer to Wolfgang, but, sometimes we're talking decades, right? But, pregnancy is an example, relatively 9-month window for us to conduct a study, get results. And I don't think there's enough, credit really given to the fact that there are these defined time periods, and whether it's an investor or a scientist, these are very great qualities to have when you're doing research, right? There's time bound. And so that's something that we're leaning into some of powering some of our studies and things like that, is taking advantage of that. But I think more people needed to discuss, because it's often like, well, what could be the return? I mean, you can de-risk that based on, that time window. So I think that's an important issue for Femtech to consider, and for investors to consider. I think the other thing that comes up for me in this conversation is really acknowledging as well that we have to align incentives in healthcare around, outcomes. And, in the US, that is not where we are today, but I think even in, some of the countries that you're all sitting in today, but also that I've worked in, when we really look at, are we truly building economic models that reward improving outcomes, addressing racial disparities? We're not there yet. And so that's the other area that I think is critical, is how can we evolve the systems to make sure those incentives are aligned, especially so that we can be proactive and not reactive.
Great, thanks for that, Aimee. Anastasiya, and then I'll come to Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you. And I love what's been said, because I think I'm just going to expand further on that. So innovation is really close to my heart with all the startups I've been working to support. And I think that women's health is quite particular in this way, because we have such a huge lack of treatments and clinical guidelines, and all these therapies that we'll have to face it will take a long time to develop. So we can't expect all this to change quickly, even maybe in the next few years. But what can change in the next few years are those innovations that are being developed. So I see these startups and innovation as something that could bridge this gap quickly for women that desperately looking for solutions. And even if it doesn't cover all aspects of, patient journey and treatment, these startups can provide really quick solutions to those problems where currently women are just totally lost and don't have any support. So for example, if we talk about, neurology and brain health, just something that came to my mind, in the last days, I've been participating to the Canada G7 Brain Economy Summit, and this topic was quite widely discussed there as well in terms of women's health and how much we still don't know about women's brains. So women's brain changes dramatically during pregnancy, for 2 years postpartum, during each cycle, and during menopause, including the first symptoms of Alzheimer appear many times during this transition. So there are a lot of things that are connected there, and we're, for now, our healthcare is like totally ignoring those. For example, even about the monthly cycle brain transformation. So while it will take a lot of time to really do research in this area and release new treatments, there are many startups emerging now that can track your mood swings, track your productivity, inform you about your cycle, track your hormones, and integrate all this data with, for example, some other wearables data and sleep, giving you actionable insights on how to manage your lifestyle better and try to minimize the effect of those brain changes into your everyday life. So that's just one example. And then if we talk about commercialization, which has been just now covered by Annie and Aimee, I would like to add is that we need to always remember how hard it is for femtech startups to go into reimbursement and certification and regulatory approval, because many times there are no established clinical protocols, there are no track record or history where regulators can find similar solutions to compare them with. So many times it takes just double time and effort for femtech startups to get through those approvals. And again, this needs like systemic collaboration of all industry stakeholders to make this better.
Thanks, Anastasia. Wolfgang, innovation, new approaches?
Yeah. I think it's really amazing to see how many innovations have been brought to the cancer field over the past couple of years. Just to give you an example, and it has already been mentioned, AI-powered tools, for example, to analyze mammographies or MRIs, with the consequence of better, earlier detection of smaller lesions, which no image specialist would be able to see with his or her own eyes. And also getting rid of the variability in the radiologic assessments between assessors, all important aspects. And an innovation which I like even better because it addresses the needs, particularly also in low-income countries, is a solution, a smartphone-based solution that allows to take thermal images of a woman's breast. A relatively cheap device. Even women in low-income countries can afford. You load up an application and monitor, do the monitoring job. This is a very simple approach to overcome geographical hurdles when lack of a transportation system, when geographical distance is an issue to see the doctor regularly. All this said, I think and as important as innovation is, sometimes you can also make a big change just by doing the obvious. What do I mean? Imagine two laboratories. Each of these laboratories is equipped with the same highly sophisticated next generation sequencing instrument. They have an equally well-trained and experienced team. each of those labs gets the same sample to do the sequencing job. When I read it, I was really blown off the shoes. But the point is, if you take this approach, there's a higher than 70% chance that the sequencing result is different in these two labs. This has nothing to do with the experience. This has nothing to do with the technology, which is accurate and precise down to the molecular and, if not atomic level. It has to do with what happens to the sample before it goes into the sequencer. Which is the driving force behind this inter-laboratory variability. Sample collection, embedding, staining, all of prone by high variabilities adding up to this big issue. So if one harmonizes the whole process in a given lab and harmonizes it across different labs, you can produce much better and much more reliable results, avoiding a situation where there's a risk for a patient that if she goes to two different cancer centers, she might end up with two different treatment decisions, or even worse, she might be missing the opportunity of an innovative and optimal treatment opportunity. That can be addressed and should be addressed by just doing the obvious.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Sandip, at Answer Digital,
Yes.
you must be seeing a lot of innovation and development.
We sure are. I mean, I was just smiling when you were talking there, Wolfgang, because we actually have got a AI platform that does exactly that. It, scans radiology reports plus the image, sends that over to the LLMs, and then the result goes back to help the radiologist. And that's where the innovations really are. And we've got that live in a number of trusts in the London area as a trial. And we're also working with Cambridge University to try and do that with breast screening. So yeah, amazing work there. We are working with Genomics England on building a digitized test directory for genomics medicine to begin with. And then we're creating a unified genomics record so that patients' genomics record are stored in one place with all of their information that's required instead of it being dispersed in different areas and regions across England. And we have also created a national order management broker as well, which brokers those genomics results and tests to a national record. And we're working with all of the GLHs across the country, which are the genomic lab hubs, to do some of that innovation. So yeah, that's where the innovation lies. And I think from my perspective, just to say, the answer, this is something really cheesy, obviously going off of Answer Digital, but the answer is women. We know what our issues are. Fund women and fund those clinical entrepreneurs that are out there. I spoke to a very amazing woman on Friday with a new clinical entrepreneur from Elliscope, and what they've created is a basically an early risk assessment product for patients who are pregnant, and due to their social factors, you can get that risk score back to your GP based off of your data. And the GP will know that this patient, because they're from this diverse background or they've got these social issues, are at a higher risk when pregnant than other, patients. So, it's just getting that information back and making that information interoperable. So you can, analyze that data, but then you can also send the messages back to your GP or to your care team, which is something that, we're experts in with Answer, because we are experts in, the NHS data and how to make that available to different startups and companies. And, we love to work more and more with women entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Sandy. Denise, you talked about some very specific sort of barriers and challenges that are quite complex for women of colour and some of the groups that you work with. Are you seeing innovation and new approaches starting to make breakthroughs with some of those complex challenges?
I'm seeing what we've been just been talking about with Sandy and Wolfgang is getting Femtech tools to be out of silos, right? But where they're connecting to the patient journey, right? So to the healthcare provider, to the electronic records, and then to the delivery of care. And we're seeing more of that integration. But we live in these other systems, and insurance systems, right? So all of that kind of have to connect to provider education. So it's great that we have the tools, but if the provider still doesn't understand because they need education, then these still become sort of standalone solutions that really don't have a connect to the delivery of care. MIDI Health is a platform where they're not just offering telehealth care, but they connected to billing of insurance. They connected to sharing notes with the person's regular provider, to really sort of ease the whole burden of what the patients typically have to coordinate for themselves, right? Especially if they're getting care a bit outside of their own healthcare system because they're not able to get care. And a lot of the things that we also have been talking about are solutions and delivery processes that work for people who actually have money, right? So when I look at menopause in particular and all the solutions that are wrapped around it, whatever that might be, whether it's, stuff for my face to telehealth, these are all things that cost money. And I always think about, like, in a population like America, where we still have at least 52% of the population who makes under $50,000 a year. How are those solutions really serving them? And they're not. They're serving people who can afford those kind of solutions. So it's how do we get what tech can do down to the people that it would impact really the most, right? So I'm always about, like, every time I hear something, okay, that sounds great, but how is that going to help this person over here who might be on government Medicaid or government Medi-Cal, which is not going to pay for typically high-end solutions that we find in startups. But again, it's just how do we connect? For me, I'm always about how do we connect these solutions down to the people that actually need them in the way in which they make sense for the care along the journey of the care.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. It seems to me that equality of access to treatment and support seems to be linked strongly to something that you mentioned, Anastasiya, education and awareness, both for legislators and for people who should have access to those things that are available. I don't know if you want to comment any more on that, Anastasiya, that whole theme about education and awareness.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you. I think to summarize it, kind of, since we're getting closer to the end of our webinar, even if I enjoyed it so much, I think the effort should be really systemic on the level of the country. So education should be both private and public, targeting both university students, medical professionals, and there is a totally different aspect, which is a corporate aspect, where decision makers, company leaders, and HR should be aware of women's health issues. And it is pretty relevant in connection to what I've been saying before about commercialization of women's health apps. Since it's so difficult for them to get into reimbursement and it will take time, it's very important for them to get some revenues and some tractions before with a B2C concept or with private partnerships through insurances or employers, for example. So there we get these two other layers of awareness, which is corporate awareness and which is, of course, the fundamental awareness of women themselves about their issues, right? Because now we finally started talking about menopause, and we realized that women might spend in menopause around 30 years of their lives, and we've been barely addressing it through our healthcare systems before. Moreover, it's been always represented as women 50 plus, while perimenopause symptoms can start appearing at 35 plus. So many women are still very much unaware to what's happening to them when they start getting first symptoms. They are looking for totally different conditions rather than looking into menopause. So awareness starts there. And by the way, these innovations and apps, they are doing a great job in trying to reach women and explain to them what might be happening to their bodies.
Thanks for that, Anastasia. Anastasia just mentioned, I had actually forgotten that we're sort of drawing to the end of this discussion because it's been such a fascinating topic and we've had so many examples given to us. Just before we sort of round up, and I'm going to go round the panel again and ask for some final thoughts, is there anything that we haven't covered that anybody would like to speak about before we just draw things to a conclusion? No? Well, we'll go round the panel again, and I'm just going to ask for some final thoughts, specifically thoughts about the future. You know, if there was one or two things that you think we could do that could be done that would make a fundamental difference and allow us to make significant steps in closing that gap that we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, what would those things be? And I hope there will probably be legislators, policymakers listening to this. So it's a chance to send a strong message to those people that might actually be able to help deliver some of that impact. And I'll go in reverse order this time, Annie, and start with you since you went last when we started that discussion. So just final thoughts, one or two things that you think would make a really big difference.
Yeah, I think to pick up on the discussion from earlier around the need for more capital, what I would say is there's a massive opportunity out there in the women's health field and as well as in the child health field. And so what I would encourage the group that you just mentioned, the policymakers, to think about is to flip the script a little bit and you know, I think a bit differently in the US because of the privatization of healthcare, but for other economies that are a little bit more government centric, but even in the US as well, I think it still applies. That investment in women's health research or productization or commercialization has a huge return at the economy level with respect to GDP growth ultimately, but from, you know, if women are more healthy, we know that women spend 25% more of our lives sick. Think of the opportunity that presents as opposed to the cost. It truly is an investment. And then the other group I think that wasn't mentioned is really the wealth owners. So I spend a lot of my time fundraising as a fund manager. It's really quite impressive how much of my time that occupies. But what I'm seeing recently is the next gen. So we know that wealth is transferring during this decade from traditionally male asset owners to women and to their children. Look to women and child health as a huge investment opportunity. We're seeing that exits are happening. We're seeing opportunities for roll-up strategies, consolidation. And I think all that education that my co-panelists have talked about is making its way through. Women are becoming more health-seeking, and so that represents a massive opportunity for financial performance as well as a positive impact. It truly is a sector where impact and financial return can align. So those are my thoughts.
Great, thanks very much for that, Annie. Denise, can I come to you next for your sort of final thoughts? One or two things that you think would make a big difference?
I think, you know, reframing aging as power and not decline, and looking at a greater collaboration between science, you know, for me, journalism, because I'm in entertainment, and how we tell the story, right? How we tell the story about, you know, we're in this conversation, we didn't even talk about the impact and the power of media, right? And how it's used definitely in the States so much to drive our belief in something being good or belief in something not being good. And this applies to tech. So if a particular tech aspect gets out as not being good, even though it is, it kills it. It's, you know, it's really over. And so how do we, as those of us who are in the science world, those of us who are in healthcare and communicating that, those who are the scientists, you know, how do we make sure that we are putting out the kind of message, the kind of correct message about what we're doing so that people embrace it, and we find that we can create movements inside what we're doing, right? We can get more women to support. You talked about the transfer of money. Part of the reason why we've seen so much thrust into women's health solutions, because women have now started to have the money to invest into those solutions, and they're tired of waiting for someone else to come and do that. And they're either coming and collectively putting their money together, or as an individual with wealth, putting their money and supporting a lot of the innovation that I see definitely in maternal health, as well as in perimenopause and menopausal health. And I think that will continue. I think as kids see their moms suffering and as their wealth grows, they will start to invest as well into that. And so, you know, I just see that the public conversation, we have to also include mainstream media so that we can continue that these solutions can actually happen when they actually get promoted, that they're successful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Denise. Wolfgang, your final thoughts on big breakthrough areas?
Well, I think one aspect where I would expect a breakthrough is really if we manage successfully to significantly increase the sensitivity at all levels towards female and gender health questions. I have to say, I'm always surprised, to realize that outside this Femtech bubble, which I am in, how much ignorance there still is around. So creating sensitivity at all levels means bringing everyone who might have a role in this whole process, all the stakeholders, starting from health researchers, health providers, cancer care protocols, investors, you name them, all of them need to get more sensitive. But this is paralleled also with the capability of listening. We all know, everyone is only willing to speak openly about an issue when you know that there's someone who will listen to this. And this is also a missing piece. I think a lot of things are just overheard, overlooked, or even kind of discarded. I think if we manage these two things, bringing them together, that will make the whole difference in the mid-run already.
Great. Thank you, Wolfgang. Sandip?
Yeah, I think looking at the English healthcare system, I think let's go back to basics a little bit and give women access to women's health, information at your GP practice. Our GPs generally are not informed on perimenopause, menopause, hormones, so let us go to our GP practice and talk to an expert and make that available to all women. Doesn't matter where on the kind of diversity scale you are, because what I'm finding is what Denise said earlier, that people can afford that care at those higher income streams, but those people that don't have that don't have access to that healthcare. And I think the other thing is, instead of creating more data sources, why don't we look at the wealth of data that we've got already, gather insights from that data to begin with on the nation's women's health data. And then we can go and look at the data gaps from that and then build upon that. I just don't even think the basics are happening at the moment.
Thanks, Sandip. Anastasiya.
I think I would summarize it as that we owe women around 30 years maybe of research and catching up to do. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, whether you are a policymaker or a manager of a company. But then if we're talking beyond pure objectives to improve lives of women, though there are also economic objectives. And first of all, every dollar of investment in women's health will provide a $3 return. And then, as we know, women frequently manage household expenses for healthcare. Moreover, women also seem to be more technologically savvy when it comes to digital health. For example, there is interesting data from DiGA reimbursement pathway in Germany that says that around 60 to actually even 80% of DiGA users, so these reimbursed digital apps users in Germany, are women, which is pretty surprising, but I think remains hugely unaddressed. So let's address women both for providing better care for them, but also for getting economic returns and developing the whole industry.
Thanks, Anastasiya. And Aimee, you get the final word.
There's so many things to say, but I'll focus on two areas. I think that we really need to keep in mind the patient-centric model, right? So we've talked a lot about women knowing their bodies, women's voices. So always working backwards from that patient. It's not something that happens naturally in healthcare. It happens in other industries all the time, but really putting the patient at the center is critical. I think what goes hand in hand with that is women using their voices, and actually, as brought up by several of the panelists, their purchasing power. Like Denise, I struggle with the inequity, and especially new innovation is often expensive, but that is unfortunately just the path of innovation. And I think that with more women having more purchasing power than ever, really at a global level, women have to step up and advocate, and that's both using voice as well as wallet, and that will ultimately, I think, improve access for everyone. But it's a difficult reality to accept, but I think more women can embrace that, the more we'll see change faster.
Thank you, Aimee. And that brings this discussion to a close. I'd just like to take this opportunity on behalf of Femtech World to thank what has been a truly international as well as distinguished panel of experts. I think this has been a profoundly important discussion, so I hope for everybody watching, you'll share it as widely as possible. This discussion will be on the Femtech World site, but also in YouTube. And it really does deserve to be seen by as many people as possible. So thank you for watching. And once again, thank you for the insight and the experience that our panelists have brought to this discussion. Thank you.